We're back to speak to the other top candidate running for Kansas' 3rd Congressional District, Republican Amanda Adkins.
I simply believe that decision-making needs to lie in the hands of the individual and the family, that I want people to be in the power seat to make decisions.
As we've said, Adkins is back running for election in the 3rd District, hoping to turn the only blue congressional seat in Kansas red on November 8th. Adkins, who lives in Overland Park, is no stranger to politics. She served as chairwoman of the Kansas Republican Party. She was an advisor to former Governor Sam Brownback, who appointed her chair of the Kansas Children's Cabinet, and she worked at Kansas City-based Cerner Corporation for 15 years before leaving in 2021. She now joins us here on Heart of the Matter. Thanks so much for coming and taking the time.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
Let's jump in. The last time you ran for this seat, you ran against the same opponent, lost by 10 points or so. We know the face of the district has changed. So what do you think makes it different for you and your campaign this time around?
Well, it's not just that the district is different. The environment is different right now. As many people know, I've said I made the decision to run because Joe Biden was elected president, and I knew that his policies would be bad. What I didn't know is that they would be this bad. We're in a position right now in the country where people are very worried about the trajectory. They're worried about the future. And they're especially worried about the economy. Joe Biden, and Sharice Davids has voted for all of it, has made some disastrous economic decisions that have resulted in record 40-year high inflation. And families in this district right now, they are suffering. They're paying easily an extra $8,600 more per year because of votes like the American Rescue Plan. It has directly contributed to the daily life and experience of people, and we need change. We need change in this country.
What policy would you specifically put into place if elected to try and help with inflation right now?
Well, first, we have to stop the reckless spending. And certainly there are some things that have been pushed forward by Sharice Davids, like this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is full of spending. We need to pare some of it back. And I would just start with the money that was put in there to hire a lot more IRS agents. I'll just tell you, people in this district believe that's only going to contribute to more audits, regardless of income level, and they're concerned about it. The second thing that we really need to do as a country is focus on deficit reduction over a period of 5 to 7 years. So we need to get down to zero deficit. And then finally, people in their own households have to manage their own budgets. Congress needs to focus on balancing the budget over the long term. Those are commitments that I make to people in this district, and it's really important. The future is important.
Sure. You've said in the past that you support a special blueprint plan to reduce the federal deficit by a group called the Republican Study Committee. It calls for a number of changes, including raising the retirement age for Social Security, phasing out the federal Head Start program, cutting spending on Medicare and crop insurance. Do you support those moves?
When I commented on the Republican Study Committee plan, I was specifically talking about discretionary spending. So that plan does call for rolling back significant regulations that the Biden administration has pushed forward. So that's what I focused on. But really quickly, let's talk about Social Security. I do want to protect that program. I think that we need to go back and learn from history. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill were great partners in the 1980s. They did some good work together to reform Social Security. Congress needs to come together now. We need to not be partisan about it to make some changes. One of the things that has not been talked about enough that I think is important, we need more workers in the system contributing to Social Security. The big problem that we have, the reason that we're moving toward a financial crisis here in 10 years, is that we have a lot of people retiring. We don't have enough workers in the system. I'm in favor of, I was a woman in the workforce. There are a lot of women who are seeking to get back into the workforce post-COVID. I think that we need to take steps to help them. In addition, I think this country needs to focus on immigration as a workforce issue. We need to have a serious opinion about the skills we're looking for in this country, the industries that we seek to grow, and we need to be serious, bring more people in. There are steps that we can take to both protect Social Security and grow as a country, which I think is really important.
Let's talk a little bit more about this blueprint, because you said you talked about a specific part of it. Built within this blueprint is talk about abortion restrictions, and we know that this was something that means a lot to Kansas voters, objectively, from what we saw in August. There are 23 federal limitations on abortion in that blueprint. They cut federal funding to abortion clinics. They bar abortions after a fetal heartbeat's detected. I know that you've said publicly, and we're not going to get through the federal ban on abortion. You said you do not support Congress trampling on states in that regard. But would you support any additional restrictions on abortion?
Here's what I've said to people, and Sharice Davids, by the way, has been very deceptive and dishonest in her characterization of me on the issue. With the Dobbs decision that was made by the U.S. Supreme Court, this is now a state-level issue. And I do strongly believe that any decision making related to the issue needs to happen close to the people.
And that includes limitations.
And as a result of that, in running for federal office, it's the reason why I do not support a congressional ban on abortion, and I do not support any policy making related to fertility or contraception at the federal level also. Again, it needs to be happen and occurred close to the people. That said, here's the difference between the two of us as candidates. I strongly believe that the government should not be spending money on abortion. Taxpayer dollars should not be used on abortion. I also strongly believe that that late-term abortion is awful. Sharice Davids, by comparison, does support taxpayer dollars being used for abortion. She also strongly supports very painful late-term partial birth abortion. Those are the major differences between the two of us when it comes to the issue, and voters deserve to know. But the last thing that I would say about it is that that is not the #1 issue for people in this district and or around the country. People, again, are very worried about the economy. They're worried about inflation. They're worried about interest rates. They're worried about their 401ks disappearing and the stock market being significantly impacted by the poor economic decisions of Joe Biden that have been voted on and supported by Sharice Davids. Big difference between the two of us.
Sure. I only bring it up because it was such a huge issue and is such a huge issue, as we saw at the ballot box in August in Kansas in the primary, with them both failing so remarkably. So I'll just reiterate, would you vote yes on any federal limitations to abortion?
I have already said I do not support a congressional ban. This is a decision. I believe in federalism. Sure. There are issues that should be appropriately handled at the state level. And I think this issue in particular, decision making related to abortion policy, needs to happen at the state level and very close to the people. And that is my position.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Amanda Atkins, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.